Britain fell in 28 days, but it didn't go from normal life to total collapse overnight. It fell apart in layers, and each layer that failed closed off one more way out. So the question I want to answer in this video isn't when Britain officially fell, it's when you still had a chance to leave, before the roads, the cities, and the public reaction turned escape into a losing race. And fortunately, the movie actually gives us enough information to map that out, and the window to leave is a lot worse than most people might think. Now, what made 28 Days Later so brutal was the speed mismatch. England was trying to process the outbreak as civil unrest, but the rage virus behaved more like an electric shock, jumping from body to body. The police didn't get to stabilize anything, hospitals didn't get time to sort the exposed from the unexposed, and the public didn't get the time to watch, interpret, and then react in stages. By the time people knew what was actually happening, the situation had already spiraled out of control. So I want to go through this as somebody who had boots on the ground. Not as Jim waking up in the hospital bed with the world already gone, but as you or me, a regular person living through the first phase of the outbreak, while things still look disorganized, temporary, and maybe even survivable. But first you need to understand why that window to leave was so small in the first place. First off, this isn't a slow-moving infection. The film establishes that the rage virus transmits through the infected blood and saliva, and once it gets into you, the change happens in seconds. Not hours, not days, seconds. A slower outbreak gives a country room to separate the sick, issue warnings, shut down transit, and to try to keep order. Here, one bad exposure in the wrong place can flip a crowded room before anyone's even processed what they're looking at. And that's what makes the infected so devastating. Not just the aggression, but the fact that every crowded space becomes a hazard almost instantly. A hospital waiting area, a police line, a traffic jam, a shelter, a fuel queue, a train platform. All of those places exist because people pack into them. Under this outbreak, that density turns quite lethal. So that's how fast the virus moves. But here's what makes the collapse so interesting. It's not the virus alone that dooms Britain, it's how the country reads and reacts to it. In the movie, the character Selena gives Jim the clearest summary of the collapse. And the first thing she says is that it began as rioting. That line's important because riots are something people believe a modern state can handle. If the first reports look like unrest and street disorder, nobody's fleeing the country. They're taking Pete's car, going to Mum's, killing Phil, grabbing Liz, going to the Winchester, and having a nice cold pint and waiting for this all to blow over. No, but seriously, Shaun of the Dead reference aside, this is what most people are probably going to do. They're staying at home, watching the news, waiting for instructions, and assuming it'll all blow over. Which means the best escape window was probably also the least obvious one. Early on, before the public grasped what's actually happening, roads are still open, ports are manageable, and people are still running on routine. The problem is leaving during that phase would have felt completely irrational. You'd be trying to outrun something the country hadn't even named yet. Now, what I just described there, in some ways we saw this play out with COVID, and I don't care which side of the fence you're on for that. Because the point is, in January of 2020, most people weren't changing anything. It still felt distant, debatable, and easy to postpone in your head, so pretty much nobody was worried about it. And in some ways, that's our problem as a species. We don't act until it's too late. You don't go to the dentist until you need a root canal. You don't quit smoking until the doctor tells you have lung cancer. We don't get on a diet or go to the gym until a doctor tells us we're going to die prematurely. We always have to wait for things to become extreme to react to it. Now, in regard to COVID, by March of 2020, that uncertainty faded, and everyone started reacting at the same time. At that point, you could no longer ignore it. And what was the result once everybody clued in at the same time? The shelves got cleaned out, the flights got cancelled, and the great toilet paper apocalypse began. So what exactly am I trying to say here? In 28 Days Later, the people with the best chance of getting out weren't the ones who waited for certainty. They were the ones willing to move before the rest of the country started to react all at once. In the movie, the character Selena also explains to Jim that since the infected were initially mistaken for rioters, by the time the authorities actually realized it was an infection spreading, it had already hit small villages and towns, making containment near impossible. At that point, it wasn't just on the TV anymore. It was in the streets outside. It was coming through your windows. The movie doesn't specify the exact duration that the authorities thought it was mere rioting, but it likely happened over a few days. Now, this is the part where most people are wrong about an outbreak. Everyone imagines that if they ever watched a country come apart, they'd just get in the car and go. But go where? Through what and through whom? By the time the average person feels sure enough to act, they're moving alongside every other person who waited for the exact same feeling and certainty. Now this is where the government steps in. Selena says they tried to evacuate the cities, but it was already too late. That means the evacuation phase wasn't the beginning of safety. It was confirmation that the safe window had already been closing for a while. Normal disasters allow evacuation to work because the threat moves slower than the crowd. And 28 days later, the threat moves through the crowd. Once you're funneling masses of frightened people through the roads, checkpoints, shelters, and transit lines during an outbreak with near instant transmission, you're concentrating the exact conditions that feed the infection. So if you were waiting for the government to make it official before you left, you're already behind. Maybe still breathing, but behind. The country had moved past the point where orderly movement was realistic. This is basically what happened with Hurricane Katrina. The evacuation order came late, the highways locked up, and the people who waited for the official permission to leave were the ones who got trapped. And nowhere does that hit harder than the cities. The dense housing, the narrow streets, the apartment blocks, the hospitals, the transit hubs, all of them become weak points under panic. Now add infected who can sprint, close distance quickly, and turn one exposure into immediate violence, and every urban bottleneck becomes a multiplier. And the empty London Jim wakes up to is the end result of a city that burned through order, trust, and movement options. If you stayed inside the urban core too long, you weren't waiting for rescue. You were sitting inside a machine that had already stopped working. Selena also said the army blockades were overrun. And once military lines fail, the public loses the last visible proof that someone's still in control of the map. Up to that point, people can still imagine secure zones and defended corridors. But once those positions fall, people stop following routes and start chasing rumors. That's when behavior shifts completely. People scatter, they go off rumor, they pick whatever road looks open, whatever vehicle still runs, and whatever direction seems less packed. Panic without shared information, movement without coordination, and the situation gets worse at exactly the moment people are most desperate for it to get better. Even if a way out still physically exists at that stage, it's no longer a broad civilian option. It's down to luck, timing, geography, and whether you were already moving before everyone else started to. And that's when the exodus begins. Selena says it started after the blockades were overrun, and that one sentence tells you almost everything about the late stage. The largest wave of civilian movement kicks off after containment has already failed, which is the worst possible sequence for anyone trying to get out alive. Because at this point, roads choke, fuel dries up, crowd behavior gets erratic, and every hour of delay costs more than the last. The average person in this phase is not making a clean exit. They're already fleeing late inside a system that's falling apart around them, without information and fewer options by the minute. And then the last blow lands. Selena says that just before the radio and television went dark, there were reports of infection in Paris and New York. Whether those reports were confirmed or just part of the panic barely matter. The point for Britain is that the information system itself is dying. Once broadcasts stop, people lose the last shared picture of what's actually happening. After that, there's no national awareness anymore, just fragments. So with every phase and every failure laid out, when did you actually have to leave? I think the movie gives a clear answer. Even if it doesn't pin it to one specific date, there were stages, and each one narrowed your odds in ways that were almost invisible from the inside. The first escape window was the invisible one, when the outbreak still looked like civil unrest and most people hadn't accepted what they were really seeing. That was the best time to leave practically, because the road systems hadn't been crushed yet by mass reaction. It was also the hardest time to justify leaving because you would have looked completely paranoid. The second window was the shrinking one, when the truth was getting harder to deny, but the country hadn't yet tipped into full-scale city evacuation and failed blockades. That's probably the last phase where a regular person could still make it out with decent odds. If they were already near a vehicle, already outside the densest city centers, and willing to move before waiting for some authority to tell them it was time. Then you hit the false window, the evacuation phase, the stage that feels like something is finally being done. But the movie tells you flat out by then it was already too late. Once you're in that phase, you're not running ahead of the collapse, you're caught inside of it. Chernobyl is the perfect example for this, because the evacuation was the false window. Authorities told people in Pripyat to pack for 3 days. They said it would be temporary. Most of them never saw their homes again. That's exactly your false window. The stage where official action feels like safety, but it's actually confirmation that things have already gone too far. After that, escape still happens in scattered cases, but it's not a real civilian window anymore. It belongs to whoever was already mobile, already positioned, and already gone before the rest of the country figured out it needed to be. So who still has a chance? If you wanted the highest odds of getting out, you needed to be away from the densest urban areas, quick to distrust official timelines, and willing to move before everybody else did. You needed transport and a destination that didn't depend on gathering points, shelters, or corridors that were about to get overwhelmed. And you needed to avoid the place places everybody else would run to, like hospitals, transit hubs, motorways, and any route that felt like the obvious choice. Late permission is worth less than early movement. The people who make it out aren't the ones who waited until they were sure. They're the ones who moved while the picture was still incomplete and most people were telling themselves it would all blow over. I think the movie's real lesson comes down to something painfully simple. Britain didn't fall because the people lacked courage. It fell because the country reacted at the speed of a normal emergency to something that was never normal. Every layer of response came in a little too late. The movement, the evacuation, then the containment. All of it. Even the communication. Each one just slightly behind where it needed to be. And by the time most people understood they had to leave, they already should have been gone. Alright guys, if you made it to the end, I appreciate that as always, and YouTube thinks you'll like this video. If you've already seen it, I got a playlist of a lot more just like it. Till next time guys, cheers.